What if I told you that you could get an easy 1.4 million DPS? You probably think I was one of those like clickbaity YouTubers that love to put like big numbers in their thumbnails, but when you click on the video, you realize it's all about either exploits or gear that you could never get your hands on. But lend me your trust for just a moment and I promise you I will not disappoint you. 1.4 million DPS is not only possible, it's actually quite doable. It's very much within everyone's reach, so stick around if you're keen to learn more. Guys, hello and welcome back. It's Skill Up here with another Division video. Today, I'm going to be providing my first and hopefully my only DPS build guide for patch 1.1. I believe this is the optimal DPS build that you're able to get within this tier of content. So I held off doing this guide until I was really sure. I did a lot of testing, I did a lot of looking around, spoke to a lot of people, and I'm confident that this is the right one to go with. Now, this build does leverage the Sentry's Call set, and it also leverages the Striker's Battlegear, the two-piece bonus of that. So it's a pretty sort of cookie cutter build, but there's a really important difference in it that I need you to understand to be able to maximize this build and get the kind of numbers that we're talking about. There's also the option to place in the Reckless chest set if that interests you, or if you can't get all these other gear pieces that we're talking about. So you do have that flexibility as well. So the secret sauce in this is actually electronics, and understanding why ignoring firearms almost completely and focusing on electronics is your recipe for success. Firearms is actually one of the worst stats in the game, and I'm going to explain why that is during the course of this video. And of course, it wouldn't be a skill up guide without lots of juicy math. So yes, there is plenty of that. And in fact, there's actually a spreadsheet that you can follow along in the description below. So check that out now if you're really keen on the detail, but don't worry about it if you don't want to, as I'll be explaining everything as I go. Guys, as with all of my theory crafting videos to date, I put a huge amount of work into this with testing and scripting and capture and filming and editing and blah, blah. So if you like this work and you find it useful, then please do drop a like and subscribe. All right, so let's stay focused. 1.4 million DPS, how do we get there? So the starting point for all of this is actually the Sentry's Call gear set, which has a pretty remarkable 4-piece bonus. If you land a headshot with this 4-piece bonus, you will actually get a 15% increase damage to that target. And in fact, that's not just for you, your entire party benefits from that increased DPS. Now, the amazing thing about this is that it actually stacks 3 times. And what's even more amazing is that it actually stacks in a multiplicative fashion. So what that actually means is that, it's not 15 plus 15 plus 15 to equal 45% bonus DPS. It actually equates to a total of 52% extra DPS on your target for you and your party when you stack this up 3 times by landing 3 headshots on your target. So it's just gigantic. On top of this, this set also gives you a 30% bonus headshot damage with the 2-piece bonus and 20% bonus damage to elite with the 3-piece bonus. So all in all, it's a really beastly set that is unquestionably the king of patch 1.1. The other gear sets honestly pale in comparison to this. There is no reason at all that you should be using anything else unless you are in a group and someone else is already bringing this Sentry's Call buff, in which case you would probably wear the Striker's Battlegear, which gives you even more bonus damage on top of that, but it's in a different way and it's not quite as good. We won't talk about it in this video. But essentially, that's the only time where you wouldn't be wearing Sentry's Call. So this is really good, but where do you get it? So on screen right now, you'll see all of the different slot items and where they drop from. So you can pause this now and have a look at it, but that's where you go to chase this gear. So in terms of which gear you prioritize per slot, this is actually entirely dependent upon whether or not you're going 4-piece Sentry, 2-piece Strikers, or if you can't make the Striker's requirement and you're going to use a Reckless chest instead. Now, this is going to be a pretty common route for most of you because chests only drop in the Incursion, and I know not a lot of people are running the Incursion right now, so do feel free to drop in that Reckless chest instead if you need to. So what is the Striker's 2-piece bonus that makes up the other part of this set? So the 2-piece bonus of Striker's Battlegear actually gives you an extra 20% armor damage, which is obviously really straightforward. We all understand what that means, but for the purposes of this, we can actually normalize that down to around 10% total DPS increase, which isn't mathematically correct because of the fact that enemies actually have more armor than they have health. But just to keep it simple, we can round it down to about 10% and it'll make our lives a lot easier. Now, as I mentioned, the alternative to using 2-piece Strikers is actually to use a Reckless chest. Now, Reckless is a stat that appears only on high-end chest armor, and it increases your damage dealt by around 12 or 13%, but it also increases the damage that you take take by about 10%. And given that we take a lot less damage than we deal, except in the case of like shotgunners and incursions, and given the amount of damage that you deal is actually huge, and we're now talking about the idea of you single-handedly dealing 1.4 million DPS, this is a very worthwhile trade-off. So don't be afraid of that sort of bonus damage that you'll receive because it's totally worth it. So some of you are going to be thinking that it might be really worthwhile to use a Savage pair of gloves when you're going to be using the Reckless Chest. And Savage is actually a buff that increases your crit chance against any target out of cover by 13%. Now, that's fine for PvP, but this build is actually aiming to sort of stay in cover most of the time. It's a very PvE focused build, and using this build, you're actually going to be at or near the crit cap. So that 13% bonus crit is actually pretty much an entirely wasted stat for you. So from our items alone, we can already see that we are gaining 30% headshot damage, 20% damage to elites, 52% damage when you land 3 headshots on your target, and roughly 10% bonus damage from either the Striker's 2-piece or the Reckless Chest. Now that's a lot of goddamn damage, and we haven't even got to the good stuff yet. So you might be thinking that all you want to stack when you're aiming to get DPS is firearms. But what you actually want is electronics up to about 42k skill power. At the very minimum, I'd recommend your mask and your backpack to roll with the bonus skill power stat, a triple stat rolled holster so that you get skill power on that, and then aim for as many mods as you need to hit 42k skill power. The reason we want that much skill power is because it's actually your abilities that make this entire build hang together, namely Tactical Pulse and Smart Cover. These are the things that actually sort of take this from being just a standard build like you've heard everywhere else to being the actual best in slot, best way to play your character in patch 1.1. So by now you're thinking, electronics, what the? But hear me out, because this is actually where things get really interesting. Firearms is actually probably the shittiest stat in the game right now. And the single biggest reason why it's so shitty is because there's so many other ways that you can buff your damage that are way more efficient than firearms, such as weapon mods, weapon talents, gear, and most importantly, these two abilities, Tactical Pulse and Smart Cover. Don't believe me? Please allow me to demonstrate. So here you see me dumping absolutely everything I have into my firearms stat, and I get to around 4k firearms, which gets me to a total of about 170k DPS. So that's 4k firearms with pretty much every stat that I have otherwise totally gimped. Now watch what happens when I switch back to an electronics build. You'll see that my damage is lowered to about 120k, so I've lost about 30% of my on-sheet DPS. But look, I gained through my electronics stat a permanent increase of 34% crit chance instead of a temporary 16% crit chance. Since my skill power is high enough that there's actually no cooldown for this ability, it's always up. Same with my crit hit damage. I've actually gained a permanent 76% instead of a temporary 32%. With Smart Cover, which I can actually also keep up pretty much 100% of the time, I gain a permanent increase of 40% damage instead of a base increase of 20% damage. And I gain 54% damage resistance instead of a temporary base of 25% resistance, meaning I can actually pretty much tank anything I want in challenge mode missions. And on top of all of this, of course, you actually get a bonus increase of 10% damage applied to your tactically pulsed targets, which doesn't scale with your skill power at all, so that's completely independent of this. So that works no matter where you put your stats. And best of all, my gear is actually pretty crap at this point because I spend way too much time making YouTube videos and not enough time playing the game. So you're going to be able to do a hell of a lot better at this when you really start tinkering around with it and you grind out some gear. So that's the foundation for this: Sentry's Call, Striker's Battlegear, Tactical Pulse, and Smart Cover. But skill up, you ask. Where's the math? Well, good question. So I won't bore you with too much of the detail, but essentially it breaks down like this. In my firearms focused gear, which is by no means best in slot at this point, I do about 336k base DPS, not calculating reload time. So I'm not including reload time in this equation for a variety of reasons, and if you want to know those reasons, then feel free to check my video which explains how DPS should be calculated in the division. It's really important to note that I'm talking about actual DPS here, not on-sheet DPS, because on-sheet DPS is notoriously unreliable. Do not look at that number, it's garbage. Please use divisiondps.com or the spreadsheet that I have. Either one of these are going to give you an accurate accurate reflection of actually how much damage you deal. So 336k base DPS actually goes up to about 675k DPS when we add in 10% damage from strikers or reckless, the 20% damage to elites from the 2-piece Sentry bonus, and the 52% damage increase with the 4-piece Sentry bonus. So that's how this looks before we start using any of our abilities. Now again, in my firearms gear, if I try to use buffs like Tactical Pulse and Smart Cover, because I have crappy electronics, I'm only going to see an increase of around 460k DPS on that. Now of course that's nothing to sneeze at, that's still a lot of damage, but believe me when I tell you it's nowhere near as much damage as you would be doing if you had an electronics focused build. So let's look at that. With an electronics focused set that puts me at around 42k electronics, I deal a grand total of 1.44 million DPS, which is an extra 310k DPS on top of what my buffed firearm build would have achieved. And that's of course with a massive reduction in my firearms, which is further proof that firearms is a really bad stat. And while doing this damage, I have about 70% damage reduction. I'm pretty much invincible at this point, and I can very comfortably tank 2 shotgunners in a challenge mode mission without breaking a sweat. And of course a total of 0 shotgunners in challenge mode incursion. So all of this sounds pretty rosy, but there are some things that you need to be aware of. The big one of course is that you need to be in cover to make use of all of this. Now we've all played the game and by now we know what we are doing. Staying in cover really isn't that much of a problem. We all know where the mobs spawn these days, and we know where to throw our smart cover so that it's optimally positioned. Furthermore, enemy AI has a natural tendency to push up towards you if you camp anyway, so this really isn't a problem. The other issue is how effective this build is in PvP. Now there will be some of you, many of you, that will look at this and think this build really doesn't work in PvP, and while this is sort of true, it's also sort of not. See, this is a terrible build if your goal is to go ganking in the dark zone, since you are typically going to be out of cover to do that. But for solo farming the dark zone, this build is in my view the very best that you can get. Not only does it make most of the mobs cake, it also protects you from enemy agents that are trying to gank you, since you can pretty much stay in cover and tank their damage until they give up and go away. Honestly, try this out in Dark Zone 6 and you won't be disappointed. One important caveat for this is that this is a solo build, right? So if you are grouped up with other people, you really need to pay attention to what kind of buffs that they are bringing to the team. Because if someone else is already bringing Sentry's buff, then there's no point in you bringing another one. You're actually better off switching to something else like 4-piece Striker's Battlegear, because you'll get more benefit out of that. And the good thing about this is that this gear is actually not that out of reach. I mean, it's not easy by any stretch, don't get me wrong, but it's not like it's all hard, not sort of challenge mode incursion gear or super rare drops that you'll never get your hands on. There's a good chance that you're going to be able to get this set if you work towards it. Now I know the incursion isn't the most fun thing in the world, but it is worth doing each week just to get your chance at getting a set of Sentry's Call, because it's literally just that good. So just sort of like grit your teeth and bear it. And guys, that's it from me. If you liked this video and you found it useful, then don't forget to like and subscribe. I have plenty of other videos coming up this week. As always, I do my State of the Game highlight reel, which will actually be on Wednesday this week, not Thursday, because they've shifted the maintenance night due to a public holiday in Sweden. And I'm also going to be putting together a lifesteal video, because I think lifesteal is pretty out of control right now, and I predict it's only going to get worse as we get more and more damage, but we are taking the same amount of damage. So stick around to hear about that. But for now, guys, thanks for watching. Take care of yourselves and see you in the Dark Zone. Bye-bye.